sides. So when you write a news story, it's different from writing a feature story, an opinion story, a blog. So in journalism, there are different types of stories, and basically they follow different types of formulas. So the formula for a news story is exactly what you see right here, and that's called the inverted pyramid style. And the inverted pyramid style was actually invented for paper newspapers, which I know we have fewer and fewer of today, but it still does work for web stories, etc. That's still the format that we use for our website. So what you start out with is called your lead, and we'll be talking about leads a little bit more, but basically the lead is supposed to be 30 words or less, the most important information of the story. So you want to try to get as much of the who, what, when, where, why, how, but you definitely want the first 5 words to be the most important information, which is usually the what. It's not the when. You don't want to start with a date. It's not that often the who either. So it's usually what happened, okay? And then if you can't fit the 5 W's and the H into 30 words or less, then you break it up into the next paragraph. In journalistic writing, paragraphs are never longer than 3 to 4 sentences. I'll say that one more time. In journalistic writing, paragraphs are never more than 3 to 4 sentences. You could have a 1-sentence paragraph for emphasis. So if you look at a lot of the news stories on our Highlander Online website, you'll notice that about them. So the lead is 30 words or less. Whatever most important information you could not fit into the lead then comes in the next paragraph. And then the less important details go to the least important details at the bottom. And I put a handout in the folder for you that talks about the format of a news story, a little bit more specific. Typically what you would have is the 5 W's and an H in 1 or 2 paragraphs, and then you would try to work in at least 3 sources. And when I say 3 sources, that could be research that you've done, and you have to give credit to those people, or sources online. And then, as we'll talk about in an interviewing lesson coming up, basically the most important figureheads related to the topic. So again, if you look at the news stories on the Highlander Online, you're going to see a mixture of online sources and human sources. And so typically it goes 5 W's and an H, maybe a quote from an expert or someone close to the subject, another paragraph of information, another quote from a source, another paragraph of information, etc. The least important details are left to the end because in the old days of printed newspapers, they would send a reporter out, and I will do the same. I'll give you about so many words that your story should be. But if they ran out of room when they were setting up and laying out the pages of the paper, then they would literally have to cut the bottom of the story. And if all the important information was at the top and they were just cutting out extra quotes and extra details, then they knew they had the most important information. So typically news stories just kind of end with like a quote or the least significant details. They don't have a conclusion or anything like that because that might be cut off anyway. Okay, so that's the inverted pyramid style. So as I've kind of talked about, the positive of the inverted pyramid is that if you just read the first few paragraphs, you're going to get the gist of the most important information. It has a summary lead, which means it's summarized the who, what, when, where, why, and how. It is easy to edit for space, which with websites isn't as big of a deal, but that's why it was created. It's reliable and it's organized. Everybody knows where the most important information is going to be and that there's going to be a mixture of quotes and information throughout. Today, however, in social media and, the internet, basically where you have headlines popping up constantly, A lot of times the readers already know the who, what, when, where, why, how, or some of that. And so they want to kind of skip the lead and get to some of the other information. So a lot of times clickbait headlines or social media posts will have the information in the lead, and you have to kind of dig to get information they might not know. So here's, again, and there's a handout on this, but I also have it here. So just a summary of what I've just said: the lead, followed by the W's and the H or quote, whatever you didn't fit into the lead. Transition to a little paragraph of information, no more than 4 sentences, adding info with quotes, transitioning to maybe more information, a paraphrase, then another quote. And it's this very formulaic information quote, information quote, information quote. It's reliable, it's organized, it's predictable. So different types of leads. I've mentioned the summary lead, which is the most common for a news story because, again, people want to just skim the headline and then the first couple paragraphs and get their information and maybe move on. So you want it to be short, 30 words or less. You want it to start with the most important information. Never ask the readers a question. You are a reporter delivering information to them. So declarative sentences only. You are informing them. Your job as a journalist is to educate and inform. Every time you mention a source who is a live person, just like you've been practicing in your captioning, you introduce them first and last name, you give their title or their grade, and you use the word said. So it would be Superintendent Matt Joint said. Okay, Principal Eric Ebert said, or McKenna Murata, comma, Junior, comma, said. Okay, it just keeps it predictable and consistent. And that's the information that's important is the news, not the fancy tags after the sources. And you want to draw the readers in so that they continue past the first few paragraphs. So to spice up how you would deliver information to a reader, consider this example right here. So you're reporting the facts and you cannot bend the facts, right? That's very unethical. You have to report exact information, but you want to play up again what words you use and where you place them. So a poor example would be, for several years it has been tradition to have the 2 days off before Thanksgiving. So for several years doesn't really catch that much attention. Instead, a 2-day vacation might pique more interest. Before Thanksgiving is in store for Homestead faculty and students. So again, they're leading with the what, a 2-day vacation. People want to know about that rather than for several years it has been tradition, okay? So really paying attention to the first 5 words that you're using in your lead. Here are some other examples, and I'll put this slideshow in there for you. That's just another summary lead. Another type of lead is what's called a punch or an astonisher lead. This is if you are reporting about something that's not somber or serious, like you wouldn't want to use this for coronavirus, most likely, for example. This is a more lighthearted, kind of fun feature type lead. And so what it does is it uses a subject-verb pattern, so you're leading with the who in this case. So for example, Sophia Lococo Sr. has shimmied herself a spot on the show, so you think you can dance. And that's the lead. That's the first paragraph. And so you've identified the who and the what. Okay, and then the next paragraph would say, Lococo, an avid dancer since age 6, found out the news on Tuesday when the show's producer, and you would continue on answering the 5 W's and an H. So it's a one-line punch, right? Because it's interesting information on its own, and you can use some fun verbs like shimmied, but you want to be careful about the topic that you're writing about when you use that. Other leads, we've used descriptive leads. We often use descriptive leads with feature stories, but news, now that it's digital, rather than having to be so concise for a newspaper, is lending itself to using more descriptive leads. So if you love creative writing, you love being descriptive, you might want to try this. I find too that If you're telling like a really um, deep, important story, this can work really well to draw the reader in. So it uses imagery, it sets a mood. It's a half an hour before the opening whistle. One young athlete sits in a darkened corner alone. In one hand is a glass of water, and the other a little green pill, a greenie, to prep him up, way up for the game. Down it goes. He thinks he's ready. So you really haven't reported much information in a news style there, but you've definitely done the job of storytelling and establishing mood and suspense. And again, you have to be careful based on the topic that you're writing about, but these can be very effective, and we'll talk about them again when we talk about feature writing. I'm going to skip other leads because we don't normally start with a quotation mark. So we're not going to talk about that one. So in other words, when you start writing, which you will in the next week, what is the most important information to convey to the reader right away in the first 30 words and catch their attention, inform them without being overly wordy, and so what type of lead would be best? Summary, a punch, or descriptive? Okay. So just a little bit more about what constitutes news. Um, this is an analogy. News is broccoli, or broccoli is news, I should say. So if you have broccoli, you know broccoli is good for you. It has vitamins and minerals, and it's a green veggie. Broccoli is just like news. News is good for you. Knowing where your news comes from, knowing that it's been done ethically and factually is important. So it's good for you just like broccoli. These are the 6 key news values. So when we talk about pitching a story in advanced publications, or like we will in the next week, I'm going to ask you, does it contain some of these news values? So is it timely? So when you're talking about a news story, that means something that just happened. Okay, it's relevant to us now. And we try to break news and get it on our website within 24 hours, because after that it's old and people have found their news elsewhere. That's different with feature stories. Okay, so news is timely. It just happened. We want to inform our readers as soon as possible. For example, they just released this week that we passed a $55.7 million referendum, or sorry, when I'm recording this week. We're working on a story that we will get up soon. Okay, even though the news is out there, we're going to get our quotes and talk to our sources and get behind the scenes, because that's timely. We need to get that out there. It also has proximity. So giving the example that I just said, the MTSD referendum affects every school in the Mequon-Thiensville School District. It's close to the community that we report for. So proximity means closeness. Using that same example, prominence, $55.7 million referendum passing the first time is huge news. We have passed and failed referendums 3 or 4 times since I've worked at Homestead. So this is a big headline. This is a big story. It has prominence, okay? It also has large impact and consequence. So I'm not sure how informed you are about what would have happened if the referendum would have failed. But some of the things that were talked about were bringing the 8th graders to Homestead, taking the 5th graders and putting them in a middle school. Because there's overcrowding in the elementary schools, they needed more space. And if they didn't get the money, they were going to have to rezone and redistrict and shuffle kids around. When we were actually in school buildings, and we will be again. But that has big impact. That has big consequence. So if that referendum would not have passed, the impact would have been large, and it still is large, because now we have the money to provide quality education and facilities for our students. It involves conflict, because it was actually a very close vote. I can't remember the percentages, but it was 50-something% to 40-something%. 50% obviously in favor of passing. So it was very narrow margin. And so I've read some of the comments, even though I promised myself I won't read comments. I saw either the news graphic or someone posted that it had passed. And yeah, you want to see conflict? Read the comments under the article, right? And then human interest doesn't always happen. So if you just think about the referendum, for example, it's not really a human interest topic unless you make it about, you know, the 4K kids or the fifth grade kids having to move to another school, or the eighth graders. You follow the life of one eighth grader who now has to go to Homestead as an eighth grader. And so you see the human side of the news story. We're working on a story right now, and maybe it'll be published by the time you see this on our website, but the people who are working on the front lines of the coronavirus and actually have, like my own sister has been pulled into, she used to work in the ICU, but now she works with liver transplant patients. But because she had ICU experience, they pulled her out of her current job, and she's working in the ICU with COVID patients. So if you were to follow her and her personal story, it's news because that's happening right now. But it's also human interest. So you won't always have all of these factors. But a lot of times when people come to me and say, well, let's write a story about this, then I might ask them, like, what's the impact? Is it a big headline? Who does it affect? Is it timely? Like, how soon can we get that up? So those are really important to understand. So you have a little bit of a mixture in news that it's important, but it's also interesting, or it's at least our job to try to make it interesting. Okay?